racism, ultra-violence, and furries. Have you ever wanted a fusion of these three interests in a video game experience? Who wouldn't? In the 2010s, Overgrowth was held high in the gaming conscious as a next big thing. The eyes of the gaming community and its godheads focused keenly on its combat and movement systems that seemed to provide satisfaction unlike any other. The game was clearly going to be a masterpiece, one of those indie games that define their decade, its only fault being that it was not yet done. Overgrowth is a martial arts platforming video game experience developed by the indie studio Wolfire over the horrifying span of 12 years. In this game, you can experience firsthand how it feels to genocide a race and all their children with only your rabbit feet. Or play as a sodomite and a fool who becomes a terrorist for very unclear reasons. The Archons were not wrong. Being built from the ground up on an entirely new engine starting in 2005, this game has combat and movement systems that are truly unlike any other. Even now, you can have a successful YouTube or TikTok career by simply posting combat clips from the game. However, it was not until 2017, 12 years after work on the game began, that it would finally be finished. But even now, it is hard to say that it ever truly was. Overgrowth is an unfinished masterpiece. If it was not yet obvious, the combat in Overgrowth is the core system of the game, with all other systems revolving around it. And the combat is very good. In its most basic form, combat is simple, ultra-violent, hand-to-hand martial arts between two rabbits. As the player, you have two abilities, attack and block. If you time a block correctly, you can counter. Crouching or jumping allows you to attack from a different altitude, with each having different effects. All combat within Overgrowth is a variation on this simple setup. One such variation is the system of weapons, should you desire to chop up your opponents instead of turning them to mush. Weapon-based combat is far more deadly than hand-to-hand. An unblocked hit of a powerful enough weapon is an instant ticket to rabbit hell, or heaven, depending on whether they were faithful. Weapons fall into 4 categories: dagger, sword, big sword, and spear. Each obviously differ in range, damage, and application, but are generally more lethal than hands and feet. Should you counter a melee attack, you can disarm your opponent and take their weapon, or strike it from their hands. Melee weapons are able to be thrown, which in most cases is an instant kill. However, flying weapons can be grabbed out of the sky, and not all races are equally susceptible to little bits of flying metal. The most consistent method for counteracting weapons is armor, which is able to block some melee attacks outright. However, the armor system is extremely flawed for reasons that I will go into later. As mentioned earlier, movement does contribute to combat somewhat and is a beautiful system in its own right. Being a long-legged animal, the player is able to run fast and jump high. The player can also scale ledges, wall run, and crouch. Crouching while moving or knocked down allows you to roll, which is particularly useful in combat. It also allows you to do a cool flip. Crouching adds another layer to combat in the system of stealth, for if a player is crouched and sufficiently hidden from an enemy's line of sight, they can approach and choke them or slit their throat. Movement is the second largest part of the game. If a map does not focus on fighting, it certainly focuses on jumping around. Combat, and thus movement, were always considered the core concern of the gameplay from very early in development. However, the team's somewhat misguided focus on these systems poisoned the rest of the game from succeeding. And before I can explain why, you must understand how we got here. David Rosen is a game developer. Maybe. In 2005, he released a game called Lugaru. You may think that this game looks similar to Overgrowth. You would be right. These rabbits are both racist. Much like Overgrowth, the game focuses on martial arts being perpetrated by rabbit men. But, as you may be able to tell, it was of relatively small scope. David was very fond of the game, but thought its concept ought to be explored in a next-gen experience. Thus, upon its release, he began working on Lugaru 2. In order to achieve this level of technical fidelity, David decided it would be necessary to build a brand new game engine to support the complex requirements a game like Lugaru 2 would demand. Thus, he began to develop the Phoenix engine. He continued to work on the engine for the next few years, and it slowly became what was at the time quite technically impressive, supporting high-quality visuals, realistic animations of physics, and the ability to produce detailed landscapes with ease. By 2008, the work-in-progress game was renamed to Overgrowth and was now being worked on by a larger team, making up a small studio named Wolfire. From 2008 through to 2015, Overgrowth was slowly expanded and refined. The process was highly documented as alphas were being released every week for community testing, alongside blog posts where the team would describe changes, updates, and generally ponder the direction that the game could take. In 2009, they made a blog post that seemed to suggest that they did not have a central design document outlining their vision for the game, as they think it could slow them down as an indie dev team. I have no idea if one was ever made, but I cannot find any evidence of one. Take note of this, as it will be relevant to the trouble that comes. Wicked creatures begin to take notice. Over the decade, the game slowly takes form, and by 2015 strongly resembles the product that we had delivered at launch. It is entirely playable, but lacks a lot of what separates a game from a tech demo. If it's not yet clear, this development is a bit troubled. It's already been a decade, things are taking a lot longer than expected, and they've still got a couple years of work left ahead of them. Over the next 2 years, the developers rush towards finishing the game. Very few new systems added, and a lot of the team's focus lies on getting the campaign finished, the final requirement to call the game done. Finally, in October of 2017, the game is released. The Overgrowth Campaign is complete and fully playable, as well as a prequel campaign based on Lugaru. The game does get some post-release content, but for now, this is unimportant. Overgrowth was once a shining light in the indie game community, proof that an extremely technically complex and fun next-gen experience could be developed by just a handful of dedicated developers. But as the years went by, it became clear why this road was not one commonly traveled. While the team's profound focus on combat and movement during development did produce 2 immensely satisfying systems, it has come at the detriment of most other systems, and in a roundabout way the detriment of itself. Through the development of the game, it is clear that the developers were keenly aware that focusing a game entirely on combat has interesting implications. On their blog, they openly discussed how stories might develop in a world where combat is the primary focus, and how pacifism could contribute more meaningfully here. For example, players might opt to tackle, blind, or pin down their enemies instead of just murdering them. They consider the implications of armor, how it might affect gameplay both positively and negatively, why some players might choose to avoid it where others enjoy its effects, and how the same applies to enemies. They review existing systems of achievement tracking and ponder how these systems might add additional motivation to getting better at the game. Clearly, they are very aware that there is a constellation of systems that need to work in tandem with combat in order for it to transcend past feeling like a tech demo for a combat system and actually form into a game. And yet, almost none of the topics they discussed are meaningfully realized into any systems in the final game. One of the most clear examples of where their vision has failed to follow through is in the delineation of races. Overgrowth, as the name suggests, is about overgrown creatures. The in-game world is populated by beasts. There are 5 varieties of beast. The main group is rabbits, but there are also catmen, ratmen, dogmen, and wolves. Ends these weird things. Obviously, they all look very different, and as will be discussed later, they hold different places within the in-game history and racial theories in the world, but for now I will focus on how they differ in combat. Each race has differing health, damage output, combat speed, jump height, and varieties of damage that they are susceptible to. Dogs, for instance, cannot be choked out by rabbits. During the early stages of development, it was the intent of the developers that each race would interface with combat differently. Rats would prefer stealth, dogs would prefer weapons, cats would avoid combat, etc. Unfortunately, in practice, every race is just a rabbit with slightly different stats. Their behavior differs very little, thus the difference in approach towards each race is just an alteration of rabbit combat. Dogs have more health, thus you hit them more. Yes, they do have weapons more often than not, but rabbits can too. An armed rabbit and an armed dog differ very little. The one race which differs quite significantly is wolves, but this introduces issues of its own. The developers decided that wolves should be considerably threatening, a mini-boss of sorts. In order to do this, wolves are extremely powerful, being able to overwhelm and kill rabbits very quickly. This in itself raises the difficulty, and to further this, it was decided that a rabbit should be fairly less deadly against a wolf, which is fair enough. Little rabbit punches probably shouldn't knock a wolf out so easily. But their method for achieving this is, in practice, very flawed. There are only 2 things that can damage a wolf: weapons and the fabled leg cannon. While difficult, a seasoned player should be able to beat a wolf if armed appropriately. But it is definitely not easy. Wolves are extremely fast and extremely strong, making actually landing a hit on them with a weapon and then living long enough to land another unlikely for the average player. And that is if you are armed. In a couple of cases during the campaign, you are not. Thus, in those cases, you have no choice other than to use the leg cannon, and only the leg cannon. Doing a single power move over and over on an enemy does not make for fun combat. Until finding out about this immunity when researching for this video, I just assumed that I was too bad at combat to be able to win without using this goddamned cheat move or weapons. I thought, surely the devs wouldn't want me to just do this one move back to back for the whole fight, right? I was wrong. You might expect the system of armor to create some imbalance between races, especially in a game so focused on combat. You would think armor would add some complexity, allowing players to choose between speed and protection, sacrificing mobility for defense. However, in reality, the armor system is tragically simplistic. Characters wearing armor are immune to certain types of damage without any drawbacks. Armor does not slow you down, and no playstyle is penalized for using it. Even this is being charitable towards the system, as it's not actually something players can equip freely. Players can only use it in rare campaign moments where it's forced upon you. So despite being a fully present system in the game, it really doesn't affect combat at all. It only serves as a small defense boost for a littering of enemies throughout the campaign. A lack of nuance in combat systems for a combat-forward game is a bad sign. As you will come to see, many other parts of the game suffer from this kind of flawed design. Now, this should all seem bizarre. How could the devs have such a profound vision for their combat and movement systems, only to completely lack the vision to realize that all the other systems around them are an unfinished mess? This is speculation, as I do not know the full facts of the situation, but I believe that the development of the game may have suffered from the previously mentioned lack of a design document. Design documents are used as a sort of blueprint for a game. They are an expansive write-up of all of the game's systems, how they should function, how they should interconnect, and why. These are an important tool in game development, as they allow the devs to fully and deeply consider what they are actually trying to achieve with the game. In 2009, Wolfire released a blog post outlining how design docs can be useful, but concluded that they do not know if they would personally find it useful, as they were a small development team who liked to try new ideas on the fly. This design ethos was later shown to be maintained as late as 2016, where in a video outlining their work on the Lugaru campaign, a developer, Lucas, states that due to the emphasis on knife combat in the original campaign, they realized that they would need to add more features to the melee system, and thus added the disarm mechanic. Given this, I am led to believe that there was no design document, for if someone had sat down and comprehensively written about how their combat system should work, a disarm mechanic probably would have been strongly considered. But this video makes it seem as though it had never come up until playtesting for the Lugaru campaign. And if this was the case, the earlier mentioned issues begin to make more sense, like the armor system. Why did they write on their blog about the profound nuance an armor system could have, and then develop the least nuanced armor system possible? Because there was no design document. Or maybe they were just lazy. But it would make sense that nobody had taken the time to write out all the ways an armor system should interface with all the other systems, and so come time of development, unless it stuck out like the clear issue of melee combat in Lugaru, it could just be left completely underdeveloped because there was no document outlining why it should be anything else. If this is true, then you may be able to see why the rest of the systems begin to fall apart. Given that Overgrowth is a fighting game, it's fair to assume that the player would be able to do some kind of fighting outside of the strict confines of the story. Somewhere where they can relish the joys of cat-on-rabbit crime by itself without having to worry about its moral implications in a narrative. Completely sandbox combat, so to speak. In Overgrowth, this takes the form of the arena. In the current version of the game, the arena can only be accessed if you enable it as a mod, despite it long being a part of the game, and an area that saw considerable effort during development. From there, you can choose from 4 arenas where you will fight in back-to-back duels of a couple variations. Sometimes you will be in a team, sometimes you will fight multiple enemies, sometimes you will have weapons, and sometimes there are multiple rounds of fighting. One of the arenas uses this abstract ranking system to denote an increasing challenge, and for some reason the rest just do not change at all. The arena system took many forms during development. Originally, it was intended that the player would unlock new and unique challenges in the arena with each win, and at some point this was going to follow a gladiator-style story with decisions throughout, with each victory winning the player new fans. There was in fact a large number of pretty interesting maps developed for the system. A lot of them are even quite close to finished, and yet in time the system was slowly downscaled and all but removed, with these maps now only being accessible through the game files. Further, there are many features that never ended up in the arena at all. The race system is completely absent, as in there are only rabbits. The armor system is completely absent. There are zero opportunities for stealth or any variation on combat other than senseless brawling. Some of the arenas allow for slightly interesting movement, but it's not explored deeply. I can go on. Point is, the arena allows for what feels like at best 3 different kinds of fights. This is not nearly enough variation for a game that is combat forward. The campaign features a few interesting variations on combat, but only once each, and I shouldn't have to replay the campaign just to get to fight rats. And that's not very sandbox. The game all but advertises itself as a combat sandbox. The arena is the only place where you are allowed to fight in a fully sandbox manner, so why are there no rats in the arena? This again hints at the lack of a design document, outlining the form a system like the arena clearly should have taken. There are 4 campaigns you can play in Overgrowth. They are Lugaru, Overgrowth, Therium 2, and Drika's Story. I'm going to spoil all of them. Don't worry, there is nothing here worth having unspoiled. Immediately though, I'm just going to focus on the first 2. As previously mentioned, Lugaru is a recreation of the story from the game Lugaru. It is not a one-to-one recreation, they have improved on the original where necessary, but the essence remains the same, with the added benefits of Overgrowth's Phoenix engine. It follows a very, very angry war veteran by the name Turner, who lives on the island Lugaru with his family. After being betrayed by a member of their tribe, Turner's family and friends are all brutally murdered by raiders. Turner finds out that this was all a part of a plot orchestrated by Lugaru's king as a part of a deal with the local wolf population, where he agreed to trade a small portion of the rabbit population as food for personal protection from their rabbit-eating activities. Turner discovers this and murders everybody involved, culminating with Turner performing a completely justified genocide on the wolves, where he kicks every wolf and their wolf children to death. Before dying, the wolf leader tries to tell Turner that there are always ways to avoid violence. A strange thing to say after leading an effort to literally farm Turner's race for food. This campaign is not great, not terrible. Every part of the story culminates in Turner saying he's going to kill someone and then doing it, and the weird moralism in the finale completely lacks nuance. It also only really exhibits the features which were present in the original game. As such, all the additions from Overgrowth, such as the new races, are absent. But it can have a pass. All they set out to do was give the Lugaru story a facelift. Surely the Overgrowth campaign that was developed over a decade will do better, right? The Overgrowth campaign takes place sometime after Lugaru. Turner, trying to get away from the trauma of his past, decides to move to a peaceful port village named White Flags. It's quite beautiful. Not even a moment after Turner steps into town, he discovers that they are currently being attacked by raiders. So he kills them all. A villager tells him that there are a couple more down the road. So he goes and kills them. He finds out that there are more raiders hiding at a camp nearby, and one of the villagers, Sky, shows him the way. They arrive at the camp and Sky suggests that they infiltrate the base together. Turner says he'd rather kill them alone, so Sky offers him her knife, and he takes it, remarking, "I never wanted to use a knife for anything but chopping vegetables. However, considering his behavior up to this point, I thoroughly doubt it." After killing the 4 guards, he meets the raider leader, who reveals that she works for a mysterious individual named Amethyst, for whom she is kidnapping and selling the rabbits as slaves. And then Turner kills her. A prisoner tells Turner that they were going to be taken to a tower nearby, where the enslaved rabbits are worked to death and then eaten by the captain, and that Sky is probably on her way there now. Thus, Turner sets out after her. On the road to the tower, Turner meets his first rat. Being a racist, he is very rude about it. He continues towards the tower and reunites with Sky. To no one's surprise, the area is quite beautiful. She says she is making a plan to attack the tower at night. Turner says, "No worries, I'll just go kill them all right now." She says there's at least 3 guards. He replies, "I was hoping there would be more." After killing the guards, he encounters the captain, the first dog he has ever met. A racist herself, she tries to tell him to get back to the fields, but is stopped in her tracks by Turner's high-level, fluent, black-pilled scientific racism, where he not only belittles the race of rats which he met for the first time mere minutes ago, and the wolf race he personally genocided off the island, but also the dog race by suggesting that they are an abortive product of race mixing between the two. To add insult to injury, he then kills her. In a post-fight conversation, Turner tells Sky, "I've been trying to stop, but everywhere I go it seems violence is the only answer." An interesting interpretation of events. Sky tells him of a mythical island in the clouds, a safe haven only rabbits can reach, somewhere he could find peace. But after having murdered everyone troublesome on the island, he says he's just happy to settle down in White Flag. Sky tells him that these troublesome people actually come from an even larger island, and have no intention to stop colonizing Lugaru. He doesn't believe her, so she leads him to another raiding group. After hearing the boss mention Amethyst again, and ships, he's convinced and agrees to get on the next ship off the island with Sky. But he wants to kill the raiders first. Sky says, actually we should just leave to go get on the ship. He replies, don't worry, I'll be quick. After murdering all of them, Turner's allies say they should get going. But in a strange change of heart, Turner says, who cares, nothing matters anymore. Fighting is just postponing death, and I tried revenge once, it didn't help. You just end up bloody and alone. Yet more interesting observations from a man who has just spent the past 2 days systematically hunting and killing a couple dozen people without a second thought. Sky says, at least help us kill the crew of the ship, and Turner goes, oh, alright. They reach the port and it is unsurprisingly very beautiful. Turner kills all the guards in the port and then boards the ship where he kills the entire crew. A dog emerges from the captain's quarters, who he then kills, and then a cat. Surprisingly, despite having never met a cat before, Turner is able to contain his racist urges. The cat asks him if he would like to reconsider his murdering spree. Turner declines. Now on the ship, Sky tries to guilt Turner into coming with them. Turner, ever eager to kill, declares that he will come, not for revenge, but simply a love of the game. By this point, it is clear that this story isn't really going to develop much. Turner goes to the other continent, murdering a starving wolf, an unarmed family of dogs, and a whole list of other people without a second thought, and then joins up with the rebel group. He continues getting closer and closer to Amethyst, who turns out to be the monarch of a cat empire, which desires the subjugation of all the other races into a society led by cats and based on slaves. Eventually, Turner is captured and forced into being a gladiator who also does parkour on the side. At this point, he strangely has a complete change of heart and offers a peaceful solution before every single fight. But never fear, for he is instantly turned down at every opportunity, even by his own friends. I wonder if there are game systems informing this decision. Eventually, he fights before an audience of the entire cat leadership, whereupon the rebels launch an assault on the city, allowing Turner to murder the royal family and flee the city. Realizing that the full force of the cat empire will close in on them soon enough, the rebels flee to the Sky Island that Sky mentioned back at the tower. Turner scales it and kills the naughty rabbits who live within, culminating in a horribly unsatisfying final boss. The rebels declare that here they can finally live in peace. How did the rat get up here? Turner says he must leave as the cat empire will pursue him forever. For some reason, assuming they also won't pursue the rest of the rebel group who just performed a massive terror attack on their capital. In any case, Turner declines their offer to stay and says he will go to a place where nothing ever happens. Chudner, you are wrong. You were murdering people there just the other week. With this, the story concludes. As you can probably tell, I think that these campaigns fall short in a lot of ways. However, there are things to like about them. The map design in each is a strong point. While maps are relatively small, they are themselves always quite stunning and do a lot of the heavy lifting for telling the story of the world. Each race live in different environments, each posing interesting challenges in both movement and combat, while also painting a compelling picture of how those races engage with the world. One of my favorite pieces of this are the rat swamps. Having constant fog and low-lying bushes, these environments play very nicely into the rat's smaller stature, hiding them during combat. These maps also paint an interesting picture of their unique culture, their gods, and how they slot into the hierarchies of the Cat Empire. The art and visual design of the campaign is very strong. Further than just the maps, this can all also be said about the character designs, weapons, etc. However, there are limitations to how far this goes. I would assume due to limitations in the engine. For example, in the penultimate set piece, we are in the Cat capital, but it is, quite frankly, tiny. How could this be the center of operations for a transcontinental slave empire? And where are all the people who live here? Are these 6 random cats that fight me on the way out the entire population? Are there truly no non-combatants in the city? Who was watching the fights earlier? Are they hiding? You get the point. I like the map design, but it occasionally makes the world feel extremely smaller than the lore, story, and even other maps would suggest. Despite my earlier criticisms about the combat systems, I also think the campaign represents those systems well enough. Of the couple dozen fights that are in the campaign, I think they do a good job of covering most permutations of a fight that can be done in the game, varying thoroughly in enemy numbers, weapons, races present, allies present, map design, and so on. I maintain that this kind of variance in combat should be able to be enjoyed outside the strict confines of the campaign, like in, I don't know, the arena, but for what it's worth, the fights in the campaign are good enough. Unfortunately, the game doesn't really do much more than that. The campaign boils down to a couple dozen fights, a handful of platforming puzzles, and that's about it. The game lacks the creative vision, or even just systems, to allow you to do anything else. I make fun of the fact that after every single piece of dialogue, Turner psychotically dives headlong into brutal murder, But it has to be like that because there is literally nothing else he can do. You cannot interact with objects, you cannot upgrade your character, you cannot equip armor, you cannot choose your weapon, there are no achievements, there is no way of approaching combat other than kill them or choke them out. What we are told makes the game unique is that it is a combat sandbox where the central gameplay loop revolves around your choices in how you approach any given combat encounter. But if that were completely true of Overgrowth, then Half-Life, Elden Ring, Red Dead Redemption 2, pretty much any game with combat would be a combat sandbox, somewhat diminishing the game's core value, especially when they all but removed its one truly sandbox section. Turner's story necessarily follows him killing hordes of enemies and doing nothing else because there is nothing else in the game. In fact, in some ways the game explicitly steps on the idea of being a sandbox. Take weapons. I really like the big sword. It's a lot of fun to use. A couple times in the story you meet a character with the big sword and can take it from them. It's a lot of fun. But then, come the next level, the big sword is gone. Why? Because the game has no systems to track continuity across levels. As such, every level is an island, isolated from everything you previously did in the game. The point of a sandbox is that you are given free reign to use whatever you want, to do whatever you want. Being forced to use only the weapon that the developer has granted you at the beginning of the level, and never being able to maintain one of your own choosing, so you can make your own fun, is the exact opposite of a sandbox. You might argue that the devs have given you the tools to make your own levels, and that's where you're supposed to design your own fun. That's your sandbox. But you would be wrong. Having fun in a sandbox shouldn't have to include building the box and pouring in the sand. I would also like to complain that the story was worked on for a decade, and so the narrative should have a little bit more substance to it than killing is bad but necessary. And while there is evidence on their blog of storyboarding being done as early as 2009, none of the story content they teased ended up being in the campaign. In fact, in a Q&A done in March of 2017, 6 months before release, David stated that they'd only actually started on level content like 3 months ago. So I doubt that the campaign saw more than a year worth of significant work. There are 2 additional campaigns I haven't spoken about yet. These are called Therium 2 and Drika's Story. These were not directly developed by Wolfire, but were actually first made as mods by a community member named Constance, and then were later picked up by Wolfire and made an official part of the game as post-release content. They are interesting to observe in lieu of my previous criticism. These campaigns do have some of the most stunning map designs and some of the weakest combat encounter design, but that's not what's interesting about them. Constance has, with these campaigns, attempted to force in some of the systems that the game was dearly lacking. New to these campaigns is diverging stories and the ability to interact with objects. Therium 2 leans very heavily on the diverging stories aspect, with almost the entire campaign being divided between an A story and a B story that you can switch between as you go. It follows a rabbit who, after being taken prisoner, can either take up terrorism at the behest of a sinister interdimensional rebel or attempt to avoid him entirely. The story itself isn't very good, kind of drowning under its own world building and abstraction, and with the continuity problem between maps still going unresolved, the game has no way to track how much you have done of either the A story or the B, and so none of your choices can really contribute to the narrative in a significant way. The object interaction system she added is very simple, and just allows you to occasionally focus in on some world building pieces like books and so on. It's not perfect, nor is it a hugely impactful system, but it is a welcome addition nonetheless. The 4th campaign, Drika's Story, is the final addition to Overgrowth, and actually might be my favorite story of the bunch. It's very short, only a quarter of the length of the main campaign, but I think this serves the story nicely, helping to avoid getting too mired in endless and repetitive fighting for fighting's sake and needless world-building fluff, allowing for some rather creative and interesting game design choices. It follows a sodomite cat who escapes to a land that is days away from an apocalyptic rebirth, where she is pursued by a former royal guard who hopes to make good on his oath to his lord. With the campaign exploring the futility of violence among a population days away from annihilation, the player is for the first time given multiple opportunities in the story to avoid fighting and death. A breath of fresh air against Turner's unending bloodlust. Constance's design in some cases also severely eclipses the work done by Wolfire. For example, this city feels quite dynamic and alive, a stark contrast to the Cat City from the Overgrowth campaign. These campaigns try something new, and for that I commend them. While many of the criticisms of the main Overgrowth campaigns also apply to these 2 as well, a majority of these problems are born from the sheer lack of storytelling and gameplay devices present in the game. And especially considering that they personally introduced at least 2 new gameplay systems themselves, I can't fault Constance that much for how these campaigns turned out. Constance is currently working on a third campaign called The Scar of Orwin that will apparently feature a great many new systems that I have criticized Overgrowth for lacking. I look forward to its release. The ends of my ire will focus on the description of the game on its Steam page, which is shared in its marketing across all other platforms, as it feels a bit disingenuous to me, and in a way represents the tragic perspective that the developers have on the game, seeming to describe its current state as the intended form of the game, hiding the reality of its troubled development. Firstly, in the main bio it's written, free the rabbits from their evil overlords in the main story, then play through the prequel story, and finally try out 9 years of mods developed by the community or create your own. If you go slowly, those campaigns could not take you more than 3 hours to finish, and mods made 9 years prior to the release of the game are not going to be relevant to anyone playing the current game. Do you think that Minecraft could earnestly use the idea of someone playing a mod from its alpha version as a selling point? Regardless of how mod-friendly the game is, it is strange to be selling it based on 9 years of other people's work, a great deal of which won't even work in the current version of the game, and 2 campaigns that you could finish in time to get a refund. Further down in the main description they write, you can choose how to approach each encounter. Do you want to pick off enemies one at a time like a killer in a slasher film? Dive into the thick of it and fight whole groups in a frontal assault? Steal the most powerful weapon you can find and turn it on the rest? This description of a combat sandbox is very weak and betrays the weakness of the sandbox elements in the game. You can do all of the above in Fallout 3, and the combat in that game fucking sucks. Finally, they write, you can try out all the mods that players have created. Fly around as a bat. There's probably already a mod that makes that happen. There's not probably, there is. They know there is. In fact, it's 2 separate mods, and they show one of them in the trailer. I am uneasy with the idea that a developer can advertise features for their game that aren't actually in the game, but are plugins made for free by community members and play it off like, knowing our great community, you could probably do whatever you want. To profit off of your game that severely lacks features, based on the idea that someone else has probably added features to it out of the goodness of their heart, doesn't feel like recognizing your epic community. It feels like insurance for when someone buys the game, plays through the first 2 campaigns, and goes, there is nothing in this game, why did it take 12 years to develop? There is more to be said. The game was supposed to be multiplayer, something that's been worked on since 2009, and as of 2021 was still just a prototype. The dialogue system is extremely unengaging and just looks bad. It really doesn't have to. Constance made some very dynamic dialogue in her campaigns, but it's extremely frequent that in the 2 release campaigns, the camera will sit on one rather ugly angle for an entire scene of dialogue and just call it a day. I could go on and on about the things that could have and should have ended up in the game, but ultimately, all of this points back to one fact. Game development is hard. Indie game development is harder. Overgrowth lacks a lot of what it would take to graduate from feeling like a tech demo into feeling like a fully fleshed out game worth its price. However, it's hard to hate the developers for this. In 2005, being an indie game developer as we know it was a relatively new and difficult thing. Nowadays, there are plenty of resources and game engines that any individual developer could use to build whatever they want. For David and Wolfire in 2005, if they wanted to build a game like Overgrowth, they had to build it from the very ground up. It is my belief that this game is the mess that it is due to the lack of a strong central vision for the game in something like a design document, but this was a small, inexperienced team building what they felt was fun. It is easy to understand how a project like this could wander directionless for so long when it had nothing to hold it steady but its combat system. From what I can tell, the last 2 years of Overgrowth's development was stagnant. Very little of anything new, other than the campaigns, was added. The old was just fixed. But when the game had been in development for 10 years up to that point, you can understand why they just wanted to finish it. If you're 10 years into early access and the game has half the features it needs, you're not going to spend another 10 making it perfect. The window for hype, success, and relevance to the current gaming community probably passed 5 years ago. They could have done a lot worse. At least Wolfire had the dignity to cross the finish line, and with a pretty good game to boot. Clearly, they had high hopes for the game if they were willing to sacrifice 12 years of their lives for it. 12 years that could have been spent building a career in an extremely quickly growing industry. The developers sacrificed a lot for this game, and it is sobering that so much life and talent was spent only to come up somewhat short. But I am happy that we at least got what we did. There are many things that I wish were different about Overgrowth, but it is undeniable that it does a lot of things very well. If you enjoy sandboxes, interesting combat and movement systems, or like what you've seen in this video, then chances are you will get your money's worth. The game is desperately lacking many systems, but the systems that are there are close to perfect and 7 years later still stand up great. It was the very first game I bought on Steam, and over the years I have racked up over 100 hours in it. Hours I do not regret. While it is only a portion of a masterpiece, it is a portion I am happy I've gotten to enjoy. This is my second ever video on this channel, and I hope you enjoyed it. I am trying my best to produce these on a regular basis, so if you would like to see more, please do like, comment, or subscribe, or even go watch my other videos so I can figure out if I'm doing the right thing. See you.